Welcome to another Enspiral podcast. I'm here today with Joshua. Hello, hello, welcome.
Hello.
Super happy to have you here with us today. And Joshua is the source of Enspiral, which is this mysterious function in the history. And I thought that, there's many already conversations about how Enspiral started and how it was evolving. But I'm curious in the specific moment in your mind when this very first idea just kind of popped. How did it feel like? What was it? What led to this very tangible moment in time?
I actually reckon there were three moments. If I think about and again, lots of little ones, but if I think about the big moments, so probably three. First one was in like 2013 when I was starting, I was going to go freelancing. I wanted a company and I was basically going to call the company something. So I basically was on the phone with my mother for like 2 hours as we were thinking about names. And I was just looking for .coms that were available. And this is when Enspiral got its name. And it was all about I was looking at things that were related to spirit or breath or related like respiration or things that were sort of inspired by nature. So seeing like in spirals and the Fibonacci sequence and that kind of replicated in nature is where the spiral bit came from. And N was about the Latin root to create, like encourage, enlarge, etc. So it was kind of like this energy, this I'd say intention of something, which is how to echo what's happening in the natural world and to create an impulse of sort of breath or spiritual energy or something like that is sort of, and this is me on the phone with mum saying, oh, what's exciting and so on, and also what's free in the .com space. And so that was 2013, but that's the moment, that's like one moment, and it's a small moment, and it's not like a big one because, the company, I did some consulting with it and it sat around for a bit. The largest moment was probably more around 2017, doing the Camino, walked from Le Puy-en-Velay and to Finisterre. And so it was like a 2-month journey. And this was where I'd been in a web development company in New Zealand. I phrased myself then as like I was a programmer. I love programming. I love business. But I was kind of on the path of success looks like money, or success looks like progress or impact or reputation and whatnot. But and I just become a little bit disillusioned with that world of like, it felt like what I thought success looked like wasn't really how I wanted to spend my time. And I was, money's good, but it wasn't that motivating. And building businesses is fun and I really enjoy it, but it's also, what's the point of it all? And so I was really at this, like, what do I want to do? How do I want to spend my time? So I did the Camino. It was amazing, lovely people, highly recommend it to anyone. It was just a delightful experience. And I did it with my sister as well. She was walking alongside. And then the last night, so finished the Camino, reflect on this, still didn't have any answers. Still was like, I don't know what I'm doing next. And there was an art exhibition in Paris on my last night in Europe. And it was by Yana Bertrand, and it was called Alive or Vivants. And it was essentially just these pictures of animals or landscapes or people, beautiful, stunning photography, a story about a global issue like water, climate change, poverty, education, all these stories about just big challenges in the world, and then a story about some group of people doing something about it. And it was and there were 40 or 50 of these things. And it was kind of like, it's mind numbing. It's just like, you look at, and just looking at global issues and feeling them and thinking about it, was just like overwhelming. And I just walked away from that. I remember walking away from that exhibition really clearly, and going back to the place I was staying. And I was just like, it's like, I kind of feel like I've been aware of this stuff a little bit, but I'd never really paid attention to it. I'd just been focused on success and, achieving things and striving. And then I was like, maybe I should do something. It was just that thought. It was just this echo of like, maybe there's just something to do. And maybe I should just stop not really looking. And so that prompted a journey where I just, I'd been blogging through the Camino and just sharing those, I walked here, it was 25Ks, etc. And so I just started to research these things where I'd spend like a week or two or a couple of days and I just read everything I could. And I watched TED Talks were big then. So I watched tons of TED Talks about stuff and just educated myself about plastic waste or climate change, all the things. And it was, it was a bit overwhelming. It was a bit like staring into the belly of the beast of just like, man, this civilization is stuffed. Like we are broken in so many significant ways. And sure, we've achieved lots of things, but it feels like all the achievements of our modern civilization come at a cost, which is deferred into the future. And that we're just building up this mountain of debt in a way which is deeply unsustainable. And the definition of unsustainable is it's going to stop. So for me, that's sort of the feeling I had about it, which was, a fairly dark time. But essentially, I also left my business and I went freelancing, and I was a software developer. So I spent a bunch of time, getting paid reasonably well. And then I just started volunteering on a whole bunch of stuff. And that was sort of like that phase that I did for about 2 years. So I was doing a lot of climate change activism, a lot of youth leadership, a lot of just how do I turn my time into positive impact? And I'd say that was a very very specific moment that catalyzed that journey, that art exhibition. And for particularly people in the arts, it's like, you don't have to change too many people's lives. Like if you start to give 100 people or 1,000 people life-changing experiences, that's a very catalytic way to spend time. And I think there's such potential for art to reach people in ways where it can, people need to be ready. Like I was searching, I was on the walk, I was looking for something. I could have shown up to exactly that same exhibition in a very different frame of mind and it had zero impact on me. But I found it very catalytic. But then it was like 2 years of journey and thinking and trying things. And what I remember from that time is I started to do the 80,000 hours thing, where I was like, I can't remember how old I was. I figured out I had something like 2,000 hours a year of work. And if I had a full 40 years in my career, that's 80,000 hours of productive time. And I don't have to, all I have to do is spend that time well. I can't fix climate change, but maybe I can spend my 80,000 hours well. And there's probably ways to spend it poorly, and there's probably ways to spend it in a good way. And I have to support myself through that time. But I realized that was a very, emotional coping mechanism. Because if you look at the big stuff and feel it, it's very paralyzing. But when I look at my time, then I had agency, and it felt very empowering just to say, well, the game is just how do I spend my time well? And so that's where I started to think about, well, okay, if I'm going to do that, it's an optimization problem. Again, the engineer in me sort of came out, and it was a little bit of okay, let's spend 100 hours here, 50 hours here. What did I think? Learn from it, reflect, cycle, iterate, etc. And I started to think about the way I spent my time as bets, where it's like, maybe this works, maybe this doesn't. Get some data, make some choices, get ready to make some big bets, etc. And I still use that frame today. My favorite script on my computer is a Python script, which basically tells me how many days I've been alive and how many days I might be alive if I get a full run. And it's just, it's really interesting, the dynamics of seeing that number just go up every day, a little bit less time every day. There's this urgency that it brings to mind about how to spend that time well, which I really enjoy. And so that framing sort of stayed with me a lot. And then the other thing that I really got out of that time, there are tons of people who are trying to make a difference. So many people have this urge, this impulse of like, hey, things don't seem as good as they could be, and I want to make them better. And everyone's responding to that in their different ways. And also pretty much everyone is like, how am I going to pay the bills? How am I going to earn my livelihood? How am I going to have a happy life and have relationships, etc.? There's these like primary, like how do people meet their needs? And also how do people do stuff which is meaningful to them is a very universal drive. And I started to see lots of people showing up to answer those two questions in different ways. And just as a programmer consulting and earning enough money in 10 to 20 hours a week to support myself and feel abundant, and then have all this time where I just get to be a self-funded volunteer in a way, that felt really empowering. And I was like, maybe if I just help more people have that experience, we can do some interesting things together. And I'd say that insight, that was the third catalytic moment of Enspiral. That's where it really crystallized to me of like, maybe the strategy is just the more people working on stuff that matters. And that's when the more familiar narrative of Enspiral emerged, and there was no point in time on that moment. It was just like over time, there were a few aha moments in that sort of phase. And then I just started talking to people saying, hey, do you want to do a consulting together? Or how can I help you have impact? And I just started to think about, take some of my time, help people around me who seem like they're trying to do good stuff, help them succeed a bit more, was very much the strategy that emerged.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. This feels like so much golden nuggets there. And I'm just kind of hearing all that you shared. And it's really interesting that I think yesterday or 2 days ago, I was engaging with a person on Twitter about the presentation they were giving in high school, and just kind of talking, with high school students about this. Like, hey, obviously you guys see these big things in the world. And, I was curious about the questions that kids were asking. Because for me, this is always like a good barometer, where are we at with this comic generation? And the kind of questions that came up is, how do we navigate the money thing? Like, how do you actually get paid enough so you can live well and then do the meaningful stuff? And how do we organize? Because it seems that petitions don't really work. So another insight, right? Like, how do you bring people together straight away? It's really fantastic to hear about your experience. And one thing that is coming up for me, I mean, there's a couple of things, but maybe let's start one thing at a time, is that it's kind of interesting to notice this very business side of Enspiral from the very beginning. I mean, from the first aha moment when it was, a conversation with your mom and processing, and at the same time looking for an available domain within, this .com era. And okay, then you go on a Camino, and it's this kind of processing time, taking time away. But this business side and I guess the money side of it as well, it's always there, which is a very fascinating issue for me, because I know personally there's plenty of people in the world right now that really want to do meaningful work, but the financial side seems tricky. So I'm curious how this side of Enspiral actually evolved kind of from the start. It seems like it's a very big part of the DNA. And it feels to me like it's an important topic to touch upon.
Yeah, cool. So I think a couple of two big ideas come from me. One is it's just like my personality. I like business. I've been in business most of my career. I had one job at the beginning of it. So I was always framing things as an entrepreneur or a freelancer or a self-employed person. And that's how I navigated the world. So those are the sort of tools I reached for when I was like, let's do stuff in community. Well, let's do business in community was one of them. Just, I'd say, my personal predilections. But the other one was also a bit of analysis around, okay, if we're looking at global issues and looking at the big forces which move all of human society, it's like, okay, there's political sort of actions, and that's the world of getting lots of people to back you, finding messaging which hits a large number of people, and getting political power to basically exert pressure, whether it's exert pressure on politicians or get people into elected office, etc. And it seemed to me that that's great and it's beneficial, and I'm glad it exists. And also it's gotten certain trade-offs. And I felt like that I don't know if we will save the world's the wrong word, but I don't know if we're going to fix our big challenges with political solutions. To me, politics seems to respond rather than to lead. And the things which I've seen lots of people who are very ideological and have opinions about what everyone needs to do together get into elected office or influence politicians. And as soon as like a large number of people disagree or it gets scary, they just throw the radical stuff out and they respond to what is the lowest common denominator, or at least like the largest median thing. So that was one of the reasons why I was like, I don't think political solutions are sort of a solution on it or a way on it. And then it was like, you can look at, to me, the idea of business was it's responded really rapidly and evolved very rapidly over the years. And it's starting to co-opt political power, where it's like, oh, one of the things that it's like the corporations control government more than they used to. And the governments still have power and its attention and so on. And a lot of them, control them and serve them in very self-serving ways. And you can see a lot of toxicity which emerges from that. And a lot of people who are pushed away from, I guess, the financial system or the economic activity because of what people see as the consequences of money or hideous corporate behavior, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there's something about the tools of business which are fundamentally they're autonomous. So it's like, if I've got a business, I don't have to seek someone's permission. I just have to make my customers happy. It's like there's this freedom which comes, and autonomy comes, which, one, at a very small level, if you're a successful freelancer who can fund yourself off 10 hours a week, you're unaccountable for the rest of your time. You can spend that how you want according to your values. So there's a lot of freedom and autonomy which comes from it, which again is, I'd say, a very, personally important to me. I think I'm just a big toddler sometimes, and I really enjoy freedom and getting to choose what shoes I'm wearing rather than have someone tell me what shoes I'm wearing in the morning, etc. But there's also like the fact that it works at a small scale, but also business has proven to work well at large scale. Work well at a large scale. If you can build an economic entity which employs 50,000 people, or they get their livelihoods through it, you will be a force to reckon with who will be able to have very significant impact in the world around you. And so it felt to me that it was accessible to us as individuals. But if we figured some stuff out, and you look at people like Mondragon or other large entities which feel like they've baked their values in, that was one of the early inspirations for me. It was like, maybe we get to participate in those sorts of very large experiments. So that's kind of why. So personal preference, and also maybe my personal preference just led me down a path of reasoning, which was like, actually, I think doing financial things together is a good thing. The third one I'd say is that this is another little ingredient was I'd been to a bunch of what I'd call transformative retreats during my time of freelancing and things, and just seeing the power of like really well-facilitated, immersive, hosted experiences, life-changing for people, amazing ways of being. And also I saw a lot of communities were doing this where it was like, and there's a big gap before the next one. And there was no real reason or impulse to basically connect with people between these transformative events. And people would do a little bit of it, but it wasn't sort of structured. And I was like, well, everyone's busy earning money and livelihoods. Maybe if we do livelihood-based experiments or interactions or games together, we can be in community between these events, which I'd say was maybe more of a tactic than a core thing, but that was something that emerged in Enspiral as well.
Thank you for sharing. I really love this idea of kind of employing business tools for good and just taking the mechanics of it. And I'm really fascinated by this. You keep kind of coming back, or it seems to me like framing things in terms of time. And it seems like it has this strong connection with freedom and, kind of, like if I'm a freelancer working 10 hours per week, that just, that's it, what I need. And the rest is my free time. That's really quite liberating. You can really choose to do a lot with your free time. And you can employ it to like really creating amazing projects and positive impact. And connecting it back to this idea of calculating like how many days you were already alive and how many you have left. It's kind of interesting because I'm coming from a very pen and paper environment. Like that's kind of I enjoy the digital side of things, but I'm really primary journal, cards, all that stuff. And I reached a very similar conclusion. And I had this journaling system when I would literally write the number of the day in terms of like, this is like 10,000 whatever, 13,074. And it had such a powerful motivation that on one hand, like, the time is ticking, but on the other hand, there's like so many days in the pool of days available that even if today, I'm not behaving optimally, or if I make a mistake, it's fine, like I can start again tomorrow, let's go, and have this continuous motivation. So just wanted to share that back. And I really like this.
Just to interrupt, like it was you sharing about that experience which prompted me to write that script. I'd always done the 80,000 hours thing, but when I heard about your experiments, the phrase that I think really hooked me was when you think about things as a Monday, it's just another Monday. I had a Monday last week. I'll have another Monday that next week. There's this homogeneity that comes out of it. Or this fungibility perhaps. And for me, just this day is unique because it's got a number that will never be had again was one of them. And that phrasing of like, and if I blow this day, there's lots to come was a little bit of it. But mostly for me, it was just like, this time is precious. Be considerate, be intentional, think about this time because this day will never come again. And it's so cliched. I've heard, people have heard those sorts of things all their lives. And for me, just as someone who spends a lot of time on a computer, every time I open my terminal, the numbers pop up in front of me. And I find it's just constant reminder that really works for me.
Wow, fascinating. I had no idea. Well, great. Thank you for sharing this. It makes me really happy. And one thing that I also wanted to kind of make this connection very explicit, that I can see how you reflected something. You said something like that. This gave you the sense of very tangible agency. That hey, like you maybe cannot control climate change or all the stuff that is happening, but you can indeed control your time. And this is really like, it seems to me like this first thing to reclaim. like as much as you, and business can be very helpful for that, because you can escape this kind of hamster wheel and chasing, you know, the money maybe from jobs that you don't really enjoy, and start generating more time that you can then employ to actually creating something meaningful. And then the question, of course, becomes, okay, that sounds like a very motivating and inspiring thing to do. And I could see already like the high school students, you know, their eyes opening wide, and it's like, oh wow, there is this people doing it, and that sounds actually reasonable to me, rather than, you know, writing petitions and whatever bullshit that kids just they can feel it, you know, and they just don't buy into it. So I guess my next question, and maybe this would be a good segue into this kind of iterations of Enspiral. I'm curious how this vision, this idea, let's help people reclaim their time, let's work together on stuff that matters, and support each other in this journey. I'm curious, what were kind of the major chapters of this journey? I assume that quite a few different things had to happen, and, you know, learning by doing and documenting the whole process. But yeah, I'm curious from your perspective, what were the kind of major chapters that led us to where we are today in Enspiral, where we're actually just kind of opening a new chapter as well, which feels a very exciting time.
Yeah, cool. So I think the end of 2009, I think of the incubation of the narrative. That's where I was basically talking to people, getting a sense of things, started to play around with early ideas. I can see iterations of some of the main themes emerge in that time. March 2010, the first full-time person jumped into Enspiral, Samson, and that was when I felt like my personal consulting company, Enspiral Limited, became a collective vehicle for more than one person to earn their livelihood. And straight away, I was like, I don't want an employee. We're going to hack the tools of business. We're going to use whatever contracts we need to and pay tax however we need to, etc. But I am trying to engage with you as an autonomous adult, not as an employee who I'm your boss of. So this is where, from the beginning, it was, and it's just, I'd managed small companies before. I had no interest in being a manager. And so that was some of the reason of going down this path, rather than just like, I'm going to manage a company well and etc. And for me, it was also like, when I before getting into chapters, I think if I look back over all this time, one of the biggest learnings for me is just how conditioned most people are into parent-child relationships. And I think as soon as I'm trying to engage with people now, this is something I talk explicitly about. And I think it's the most important thing for people to pay attention to when they're interacting in community with each other, and when they are designing community or facilitating and so on, is that everyone I've met, myself included, just deeply conditioned for childlike behavior or parental-like behavior. And it takes a lot of consciousness and training and intention to be in a grown-up adult-to-adult relationship with other people. And I find if you can just nail that and focus in on that, all the other techniques, everything else you can sort of figure out on the way. But just coming back to how do I help have adult-to-adult relationships with people, I find is really fundamental to most things. So March 2010 was when that happened the first time. And that was when I'd say that over that year of 2010 was very much like, I think we went from me and Samson to sort of like 30 people who were consulting in the business. So this was just me just doing a ton of sit downs, 30 minutes, what's Enspiral, why do you want to join, sort of thing, very active recruitment. And the idea was very much like, more people working on stuff that matters. There's a trickle of human energy going into the biggest problems of our time. How do we turn that trickle into a river? And it's funny how phrases like trickle into a river is like, it's just memorable. And it's sort of, and that's one of but that was the whole point of it. It's like, before we talk about anything else, the reason we're in this conversation, the reason we're doing this thing is primarily about having more people who get to spend the whole of their career, the whole of their livelihood working on stuff they think is important, rather than because what I found is that lots of people, particularly professionals who have opportunities and so on, there's a ton of work out there, and often you don't care about it that much, and you're doing stuff which just feels like it's making money and not doing much else, or it's working in a way that isn't the way people want to work. So I found that having that as the framing, more people working on stuff that matters, that was the core of it all. The next beat was usually around, and we don't want to design a hierarchical organization. We are looking at ways where people can be in economic relationship with each other as sovereign agents in their own right, as without having to have like an employee-employer dynamic, or this is my boss, or this is someone I've hired, and I'm like all of that. I think it's effective. It's scaled for a reason, but it's reinforced this parent-child dynamic consistently. And so many of our large human institutions have embedded in the parent-child dynamic. And there's reasons for that. Another thing I've gotten over this last decade and a bit is just like a lot more respect for the status quo. Initially, I was like, it's ridiculous that people would give up their sovereignty and be like, and so on. And why would you want to, like, it's just so much like just this is insane. The world is, all the systems are broken. Let's make our own, was probably a bit more of the energy I had early on. And now I'm like, oh no, things are the way they are for really good reasons, and understand those reasons deeply before just going and messing with stuff. And also, we just jumped in and messed with stuff and learned a lot along the way. But it's I have a lot more respect for the status quo now. Maybe that's just called gray hairs and age or something. But I'd say that was the second beat of it. And the next one was like, let's use the tools of business. We are primarily about livelihoods and helping people earn more money in a way that works for them. We're primarily about looking at developing things which can scale to meet large challenges rapidly. And that's often where, the scalable startups, they've got a lot of baggage with them, which can feel awful and toxic and whatnot. And also they are a proven pathway for people to start to impact hundreds of thousands and millions, hundreds of millions of people. Like, people have gone from ideas to touching the lives of hundreds of millions of people. And it's usually in the worlds of business where that's been repeated and scaled up lots. So there's tons of learnings we can take from there. And there's tons of learnings that you probably don't want to take from there. And it takes a lot of judgment to choose them. But tools of business was the third thing. So those are the three ideas that I present to people. And then we basically had this little, what would you say, professional services cooperative, where it's like, okay, instead of getting, if you look at a typical professional services business, employees' salaries are typically about 50% of revenue. So usually people get about 50% of what they earn, and the rest goes into paying for admin and sales and operations and so on. And there's a good reason for that. It's like, takes a bunch to make these things work. So I just went in with like, hey, you get 80% and 20% we put into the collective automatically. And that 80% you get to spend how you want. You can pay yourself with it. You can spend on other things. It was a bit of an experiment that people would spend some of their money, which was nominally theirs or under their control, on things which helped everyone, or would they just take it out and pay themselves? And that's I think the fundamental tension of doing different things or different like ratios in that way. But I'd say this bootstrapped us. This started to get money coming in. This had people showing up. We got people going into retreats. So that's chapter one, and I call chapter one bootstrapping through a professional services cooperative. It gave us the energy and the thing to keep going. It turns out it's hard to run a professional services cooperative, particularly when a lot of people don't want to do professional services and they just do it to pay the bills. So often it was really common. People would show up, they'd do that stuff, and then they'd move on from it and they would start to launch businesses. So we saw a lot of people naturally interested in entrepreneurship and startups. So the next phase of Enspiral, 2012, I think, is when we, another thing was in the first phase, Enspiral was my company. I'd started Enspiral and I was working in this way, but I was like, one day I would like to give this company over to the commons or to a group of people. Don't know when it would be. But after a year of doing this, there were 12 people where I was like, I'm happy for you to be a shareholder of this thing and for you to have equal control alongside of me. And so that's when we started the Enspiral Foundation Limited. And I think there were 12 of us initially on the books as formal shareholders, and that's where we set up. Member is someone who has a share of the company. We didn't make it a formal cooperative, we made it a charitable company, just for boring legal reasons, but it was a cooperative in spirit, and every person had the same rights. I didn't have any extra legal power in this entity or the relationship with it, and the Enspiral brand or everything. This was our legal campfire that we sat around. And that's the foundation we've still got today. So I think that was 2012, 2011. Can't remember. I think maybe it's 11. I think it was a year. And so this is where I'd say Enspiral as an entrepreneurial community was probably the next chapter. We had lots of people doing like Enspiral Accounting, Enspiral Legal, Enspiral Services, Enspiral Space. We're using the brand everywhere. We had lots of ventures going on. We played with the idea of maybe the ventures give some equity to the foundation, but then it was really hard about if you're a service-based business or if you're a startup, equity's worth different things. If you're doing a not-for-profit business, like it was a bit of a tangle. So we just walked away from it and we said, okay, everyone, have all your equity back, voluntary contributions. And because if you think about the financial model, it was very much like people doing services-based work. They chip in 20% to the commons. We had quite a lot of money, but then you're spending that money to make the professional services venture work, in which case you don't have much money anymore, because you can't, it's pretty challenging to make a model work off that. Like you can't offer much support for people working. There's a lot of stuff to get sales in. So it's just, I can riff on that for a while. But our financial model shifted towards the Enspiral Foundation is supported by ventures chipping money into the foundation. 2013, 2014, we sort of were like, what was it? Oh, this isn't working that much. So that's when we did a bit of a refactor. And that's where there was this idea of people going, hey, we need a few more formalizing our agreements. That's when the handbook launched. So Alana, Sylvia, and Billy and I led this work. We were the current directors of the foundation at the time. And I'd say that was one of the first big formal, hey, we need to think differently about how we're doing things. And so we started to formalize like our decision-making agreement. That's where the handbook came in its first iteration, and we started to lock in a bunch of the ways we did stuff. It was about when co-budgeting came on as well. So we started to do participatory budgeting together around 2013, 2014. And it gets a bit blurry then, because that's when I jumped full-time into Dev Academy as well. So around 2013, I think, was when I said I'm the ex-founder of Enspiral. I've done the first 3 years, and now I'm not doing that work anymore. I think I was the first one of the first. Well, we had one round of catalysts, and then we had another round. And when we did the refactor, I think I jumped in with the catalyst side and jumped out of the board side of things. So it's like it gets a bit fuzzy, but that's also after that is when I jumped in and started doing Dev Academy and training programmers, and that's where I sort of earned my livelihood. And that was one of the ventures in the network. And I'd say there was another sort of chapter around. Oh, the years are fuzzy, but balancing the books. So often I think of them as names or titles. Like there was the refactor, that was a thing, a process people led to correct the course of Enspiral. There was balancing the books. Ants Cabral and others sort of led this one. And this was like, guess what? Our financial model doesn't work. Turns out the way ventures give money to the network, it's not really reliable, and it's hard to, ventures would be really close to the network, then they'd move away, and why are they giving it money anymore? So that's when we shifted, and this was a really pivotal change for us. This was, we are not a network of ventures. We took the Enspiral name, or rather ventures gave the Enspiral name back to the network, because it was as confusing as anything for people. Like, is Enspiral a space, or is it an accounting service, or is it whatever? Because the instinct a lot of us had early on was the more people who use the word Enspiral, the stronger the brand will be. But only if the way they use it is aligned and understandable to people and you're very clear on your messaging. Otherwise, it's not strong. It's just weak and diluted and confusing. And we were in that situation where people would mean many different things when they said Enspiral. There was no clarity. It was more confusing than it needed to be for people in the outside world. And we basically said, we're not ventures. We're not a network of ventures. We are a network of people. And individuals are what make up Enspiral, and our financial model is those individuals pay a subscription like they would for a club of some kind. And that was the balancing the books, which basically got us onto a very stable financial wicket where the foundation wasn't worried about how much money do we have to pay for things. We're just a member-funded organization. You have enough members with enough subscriptions and you cost manage. It's just dead simple to manage. And so that was, I think it was 16, it might be 17, 18 or 19, somewhere in that window, but that was a chapter. So chapter 1, bootstrapping, entrepreneurial community, and then I would say membership-based community. And then the last chapter we've been through, it was essentially a bunch of people saying, hey, it's hard to join Enspiral, or it's hard to, like, it feels like there's an invisible Illuminati of these people called members, and it's hard to become a member. And why do we have members and contributors different power? And it was just broken in lots of ways. It was absolutely critical to how we started. I don't think we would have been alive if we hadn't have made that choice. But also that choice has consequences, and they were poor consequences for us. And also, I'd say this sort of coincided with an ebb of energy in the network where people say, yeah, there's a problem. Someone should fix that. One of the fun things that came out of Enspiral for me was like the someone should game, where you get a bunch of people in a room and you talk about a collective thing and say, hey, let's just make a list of things someone should do. And you write them up and it's like, hey, you can be a someone if you want and do something. And so this phrase of like someone should is one of those little cultural things which I've just seen persist over time to talk about that, like how you interact with the commons, etc. But this last phase was the killing the membership role. How do we go from a two-tiered network where there is members and contributors with formality and powers and so on, and how do we move towards a single-tier network? And this was really important for us because members were the people who had the power to invite someone to the network. It was always a gated community. And so, I think I might have had about 300 to 400 one-on-ones with people in the first few years. Massive amounts of like, here's Enspiral, here's how we work. If you want to join, this is the process. And I was absolutely that funnel early on. And I think that enabled, and interesting to tune back to the previous conversation, was like one of the things which I noticed about people who thrived in Enspiral were usually folks who had been on a track of like, yes, I'm a designer or a programmer or a lawyer or an accountant. And they'd been through some, I don't like this system. I want something else. Mm-hmm. And some people would go on bike rides through Nepal or whatnot. Some people would go and get into freelancing or activism. We had a whole bunch of people from Occupy sort of join in. We had a lot of people who had been like, who'd looked at the system in some way and become disillusioned with it. But they had participated in the system a bit. And I found that those people who'd consciously walked away from what typical success looks like and were choosing another path, often they would do really well in the network. But there was a massive churn. Like of those 400 people, I went through once, sorry of the tangents, but I went through and looked at cohorts of 20 people that we'd added to the network. And in like year 4 or so, of the first 20 people, there were like 2 left. Of the next 20 people, there was 1. Of the next 20 people, there were 3. It was like quite a lot of churn of people show up. Hey, what's this thing Inspire? Maybe I'll engage. I sign up for an account and whatnot. Nah, not for me. And they bounce. So there was a huge amount of churn to get to distill down the group of like 20, 30 people who were in relationship and governing this. And I think that's something which, good or bad, it's what it was. And it's a lot of things were possible because of it. But the membership thing, members were the people who invited new people in. They were the stewards of the culture. They had the ultimate power in the network. And so they were the ones who really stewarded this whole thing and felt the weight of stewarding it. And it was hard for new people to step into that role. So we dissolved it. And so now we don't have that anymore. And that coincided with the formation of nodes and the new strategy we're on not right now. And in my head, I'd probably call this like the notification of Enspiral chapter, which is really exciting. I'm super excited about and jumping into. And yeah, that's a very long way of talking about some chapters. I look forward to seeing your distillation of that narrative and other people's take on it.
Yeah, it's really cool how you describe those little stages, and it makes so much sense to kind of like bootstrap through this kind of more businessy side of things and then explore this. Yeah, we're a community of entrepreneurs. Let's do stuff around it, share processes and services, but then it might become confusing. So how do we deal with that? Okay, turning the model, and now finally removing this barrier of between like the ultimate context and culture holders and just kind of this wider group of contributors, and really equalizing this and distributing the network into nodes. It seems like there's a lot of bravery in making kind of almost radical decisions quite a couple of times. And I'm kind of curious to mirror that experience to organizations that are now maybe being built and going through this really tumultuous times when, like it feels like there needs to be some kind of change happening. What are your insights for, like, I don't know, words or advice or suggestions for navigating challenging times for organizations that just are evolving, and there's this time where new iteration is about to be born, but of course that brings conflict, that brings a lot of conflicting ideas how to go about things?
Yeah. I think that to be in I don't know, maybe not always, but my experience of Enspiral is that it's a low stakes game. So if Enspiral blows up, not people will be sad, but also it would be a chapter. It's closed. Lots of our ventures have started and closed. A lot of us are familiar with what it means to close a thing and to stop being a thing anymore. That's now a chapter which is fully, has a punctuation point at the end. And I think that because making it the stakes of Enspiral closing are fairly low, means it's easier to risk things in this context. If a lot of us would be losing our houses or going bankrupt if this thing finished, we would relate to it very differently. I think it would be harder to take risk. So that's just one sort of frame of reference, which not many other organizations might share, or some might. But the other one is that when it's, multiple times we have made, let's risk the organization on a new idea. Let's start to do something which is new and scary, and it might not work and it might all blow up, but that's okay. And so I think that's why for me, like, nodes might not work and it might actually kill the network. But a lot of what I've been thinking about over this time is like, what are network killing risks and what are not? because a lot of things which might appear risky, it's like, well, there's recovery modes from them. Like if nodes doesn't work for us, or if we don't have catalysts anymore, like we don't at the moment, like there was a recovery mode where we had catalysts that were really important, that were really great. We don't have catalysts right now, and that's okay, and we're still alive. And so I think a lot about designing recovery modes is a way to have risk, to manage risk in those situations. Because while it might appear we've taken a lot of we have completely reshaped the network multiple times, only some of them, I would say, were existential risks. And things like, when I think about existential risks for a network-like organization for us, it's basically like massive infighting. People get really upset with each other. There's a deterioration of relationships across the network, and it blows up spectacularly. And people like leave, or they try and take chunks of it with them, or there's a fight over the Enspiral brand, etc. And the other failure mode is people just don't care anymore. It's just like, oh yeah, Enspiral, why would I give that? Why would I show up to a thing? Like it just fades into irrelevancy. And I think the consequence of playing it safe is it's more likely that failure mode will emerge. If we just kept doing things the same way we'd always done them, or if we just didn't take risks and didn't try and explore unknown territory, a lot of people in Enspiral will go like, oh, you're just doing the same old thing. That's a bit boring. Why am I going to show up? But it's when you're doing stuff which is like on the edge of your comfort level, where it's exciting, it's interesting, that actually gets engagement. And without engagement, a network like ours is not alive. And so I don't think there's any risk of us doing novel things, because otherwise no one will pay attention. But I think that creates an environment where it actually encourages us to push the envelope, which is what I think a lot of us are here for. We're here to explore the unknown. It's like, if there was a pathway for us to do more work stuff that matters in a really well-known format and to apply it out, a lot of us would probably be doing it. And I think a lot of us are in some sense, but there's this research element, or this experimentation or innovation element to Enspiral, which is what attracts me and what keeps me showing up. Because there's tons of ways like where each of us could spend our time, but this node stuff and seeing the way we can have all these communities with things and take a lot of the stuff that used to work and plug it in this new way, it's just exciting and liberating. And I'm super happy to be playing in that space. And it's, starting to draw a lot more of my time in. And I think that, to me, that's the trade-off, is like, how do you make failure modes, or how do you have recovery modes so that if things do go wrong, you can recover? But also, if you don't do exciting things, what's the point of being there?
It's fascinating. It's almost like, yeah, the risk, it's just kind of a necessary way to grow as an organization, and just to keep this life in it, and not just for the sake of experimentation, right? But it's just like this part of the DNA. Like, we are creating something that is new and exciting and different, and we don't necessarily know how it's going to turn out, but let's figure it out. I'm also, I just really wanted to share this big appreciation, and I think this is actually one of my first contacts with Enspiral was through the handbook, and just seeing this like really cool open source documentation of this whole experimentation that is happening. It feels like such a valuable gift, and sharing, what is happening and what are our reflections from this whole journey, so other people can benefit. And I wonder, like, if this was always kind of a part of the DNA of Enspiral, or this kind of just naturally came during one of these phases. What was the evolution of the open source nature?
I'd say it was there from the beginning. And also, like, I'm a software developer. I've benefited hugely off open source. I really rely and relate and value open source things. I think a lot of people did from that early development ethos. But so I'd say that having a bunch of software developers in the mix who love open source made that a little bit of a cultural norm. Like, of course, you're going to share things, and of course, you're going to make it go there. I also think that, we saw a lot of people coming from sort of activist backgrounds. I know when Occupy happened, a bunch of people came in, and there was a lot of people who were more radical in their politics in a way. And I'd say that definitely had an impact. I remember, I think it was Rebel coming in once saying, I've been following Enspiral for years, but now when I come to it, I realized that a lot of you live in co-housing. I didn't know that before. Maybe think about, and as I reflected on it, it was like, oh, a lot of us were just, living in a city, and a lot of people pre-family, and a lot of people were just like in natural shared flats and houses. And that shaped our cultural experience, but it also shaped how we showed up and did something as a collective venture. And it was like, I'd never noticed it, but I think it was a real trend and influence on our culture. So open source, absolutely there from the beginning. And I'd also say that when I think about using the tools of business, it's like, what are the safeguards you put in there? How do you stop yourself just becoming another? And I mean, I think it's like, oh, we're in risk of becoming a Facebook and being whatever. But I think it's more like, what are the practices in the business community which result in the behaviors that many of us are repelled by? And I think that openness is an antidote to a lot of them. That if you make things transparent by default and you work in the open, then I think a lot of the things that, and you do commercial stuff, okay, you're going to have to manage some dynamics there where your competitors can now access things, and it's a difficult thing to do, but people manage that tension. But by having a culture of openness and of forkability, which is like, it was never like, oh, Enspiral, we're not going to tell you our secret source so that we can do it and become a network with 10 million people and everyone knows the name Enspiral. Like that's crap strategy. Instead saying, this is what we're doing. We like it. If you like it, we will actively help you to do this thing as well. Please compete with us. Please make your own thing wherever you are, because we don't like that is a more effective strategy for having more people work on stuff that matters. I've noticed a really profound thing, well, not profound, I've noticed a reliable tendency of humans, which is when you have 6 people sitting around a table saying, we're going to start something, where it's going to be called this, it's going to do this, and they put themselves into it, their identities intermingle with it, and they will work on that like they will in a very different way than if it's like, hey, this is a thing someone else has made. How do I go and create that, join that thing and play by their rules? Is a different experience. And again, it's certain personality types and whatnot, but people get a lot of value from creating things. And a lot of us who were part of creating Enspiral were shaped by that experience. And it changed us, and we learned a lot and we grew a lot. There's a lovely Maori saying about the people who build the house are built by the house. And I think that's really true in our organizations as well. And so giving people the experience of like, oh, Enspiral's done their things and I like some of it, but stuff that I want to do my own thing and do it different in this way, that's a great journey for them to be on. And if we can support lots of people to be on that journey, that's a much more optimal way of achieving the ultimate, goal in a way, which is just more people who spend their careers doing the most important work of the times. So that's another reason where there's a bit of a calculated strategy in the openness. And because to me, the most exciting thing is like there are lots of organizations which look like this and feel familiar, because there's something funny where I see people who've been in Enspiral for a long time and then they go into a corporate job and there's just like, whoa, this feels different. It's like there's so many different cultural practices which feel very alien and not as good in a lot of people's opinion. And it's amazing when you show up in an organization and you're like, wow, this feels welcoming. I'm welcomed as a whole person. I feel like we value our interactions with each other. I feel like people value the way we do the work as much as the impact of the work itself. And it's not just a outcomes at all costs kind of environment. And there's something about that, which is when people show up into those cultures that it's friendly, then it's easy to have a bridge between them. So I think the more organizations and entities where feel like people are treated as adult-to-adult relationships, that it is focused on meaningful stuff, that it is valuing the people and lifting them up, and rather than treating them as consumable resources, that's just great. And so that's another reason why openness is just default.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's kind of cool that it just came naturally, since you had quite a few software developers that already valued this, so it just kind of naturally became embedded into the organization. I wonder, one thing that really kind of struck a chord with me as a very important thing to go tiny bit deeper is you mentioned this thing about involving people in building stuff, and like how this actually gives this motivation, makes them feel alive, and it's this feeling of co-creation. I wonder how this how can you create this feeling by design? Like how an organization can involve more people in actually shaping actively the organization and being proactive and showing up and pointing out, the somebody shoulds, and actually becoming the somebody that does it?
Break the organization into lots of small pieces is my short answer for that. And I think that's exactly why I'm so excited about the node strategy, because if you're trying to manage a network of a few hundred people and you've got a bunch of ventures and you've a bunch of people who've been there new, and there's one set of things, then it's a really hard organizational problem to solve. If you're trying to coordinate 1,000 people, then you're going to start to subdivide, and you're going to start to build teams and have team leads and so on, and have this abstract reasoning. And I think that it's a strategy which lots of organizations do to scale, but the consequence of it is you start to get hierarchies, you get parent to child relationships emerging, you get different levels of abstraction, you get people starting to, it takes a lot of speciality to think about 1,000-person organization, to structure it into management. And that's why managers are a professional job in their own right. There's a lot of complexity to that, and it's a very inaccessible type of work. Whereas if you've got a 20-person network, which is a club, you can often lean on I've hosted parties before. I know what it's like to host a party with 20 people, or I know what it's like to try and get 7 people to agree on where to go for dinner. Much easier than getting 700 people to agree on where to go for dinner. And so by having these small areas, I think people can lean and have a much more accessible work in terms of, one, self-management, but also community hosting, community facilitation, community leadership, etc. And so I think there's a really powerful dynamic, and thinking about net or organizations as autonomous cells of 20 people, where it's not just like it's a subdivision of a team and they've got a manager and accountability, etc., but they're autonomous in their own right. They're self-sovereign and they're in relationship with other self-sovereign cells. And there's, I think, just natural sizes to it. And to me, the work of helping to contribute to systems where there are dozens, hundreds of lots of these self-sovereign cells interacting with each other on economic levels, on information levels, on cultural levels. To me, I think that's what that's work that is meaningful. I think that actually has a plausible way of, aggregating up economic activity into these really interesting things, which is also why, the node I'm starting is Enspiral DAO, because I think so much of the DAO, people are playing with similar things. And again, just like business world, there's a lot of stuff in the Web3 and DAO stuff where I'm like, oh, don't want any of that near whatever I'm doing. But there's a bunch of it which is like, that's interesting. I reckon there's a bunch of stuff which is really relevant to what we do there. And it's the same with military. Like if you look at military culture and the way military is organized, ton of valuable learnings for anyone who's interested in coordination and people and so on. And also probably a ton of stuff you're not that interested in. And so I think being willing to, and again, this comes back to that open source mindset of like, everyone I meet, there's something I can learn from them. Every organization I meet, there's something I can learn from them, no matter what they are or how they are. And that sort of intellectual humility of just learning and trying and engaging with people, I find that's I think that's really important if you're trying to do new stuff.
Thank you so much. This feels like a really beautiful way to end this conversation. I feel like we went on a very beautiful and long journey. Thank you so much for taking the time and share about your own hinge moments and the iterations and all the different flavors of learnings that came out of it. I feel it was such a valuable and inspiring conversation. So feeling really grateful.
Yeah, me too. And just thanks for all the work of just like connecting with people and getting stories out there and learning and whatnot. I think it's as we've got people in more and more different contexts, the ability for people to like jump between the boundaries and share things and synthesize things. Like I often think about what the journalism function of Enspiral is and or the journalism function of wider groups are and how we coordinate and get to know each other. And so just, really appreciate the work you're doing. And it's super fun to be in community with you.